This is the installation instruction for the Furman 3200, 3300, and 3600 watt inverter series generator. This kit will also fit the E-trailer generator, or E-trailer inverter series generators, because they're made by Furman. It will also fit whatever other private label versions of the Furman there are out there. This will work on the gasoline only. I have not validated this kit on the dual fuel or propane generators. Next item is, it is not a gravity feed system. It is not a cheap through the cap system. It is a legitimate fuel transfer system that uses its own fuel pump included in the kit. We'll go through real quickly. The kit will come with a sheet of paper quickly explaining that you have bought the greatest thing since sliced bread. Has a USB flash drive with the installation instruction video. The one we are shooting right now will be on the flash drive. There'll be a bag with the small parts, the PCV valve, the hose clamps, the T-fittings, and so forth. There will be two Yamaha style marine quick disconnect fittings, the Yamaha marine fuel hose with the corresponding quick disconnect fittings on either side of the hose, roll of Teflon tape, a fuel filter, a fuel pump, and a section of hose. We will be shooting the video on the Furman, but as I said earlier, the same kit will apply to the Furman inverter series generators with the 171cc engine and the 193cc engine, as well as the E-trailer 171cc engine and 193cc engine, and then any of the other companies that Furman private labels this for. Incidentally, the 171cc engine is used on their 3200 and 3300, and the 193cc engine is used on the 3650. At any rate, installation is pretty straightforward. You're going to remove the 4 Phillips head screws that hold the control panel in place. These 4 screws are different from the other screws we're going to be removing. Notice there is no lock washer or flat washer on these 4 screws. Then you'll remove the rear vented panel, and it's held in place with 6 screws. These screws all have a flat washer and a lock washer on them. Then you remove 4 screws out of the back metal panel. These screws are larger than the ones on the control box, but they also have no lock washer or flat washer. Okay. You'll notice that the control box fell out when I was taking the other side panel off, but otherwise you just take it and lift it out and let it hang down. Next thing we're going to do is remove the valve cover. We're just removing the breather hose from the valve cover itself. The valve cover is held on by 4 6mm bolts. They each have a 10mm head on them. What we're doing is removing the valve cover so that we can disable the PCV valve that is in the valve cover itself, because we're going to use the breather line as a pulse line to drive the fuel pump, and we don't want to drill any additional holes in the engine block, so we're going to take advantage of one that's already there. Then we'll install our own PCV valve down line from the stock one. So to get the breather cover out of the valve cover area, just take a solid workbench and just hit it, just a nice sharp smack, and just spin it around and do it again. You'll see that the breather plate has come out quite a bit. Then just slide a Phillips head screwdriver into the hole that the breather hose came out of and just pry down on it, and the breather plate comes right out. To disable the PCV valve, that'll be this valve right here, just take a screwdriver or something, push up on it just a little bit. Then a pair of pliers and just bend it back. So now air will go out and back and forth as the piston goes up and down. You'll notice that there's a tiny little hole right here. So when it's installed on the generator, you're going to have air and oil flying around in here, and it's going to blast pieces of air and oil into this chamber area. The oil will then run down and go back into the engine through that little hole. So don't put any gasket sealer or anything in that hole. It's meant to be there, and it needs to be there. Now we're ready to put the valve cover right back on. Then come around to this end. I'm going to take the lid off the airbox. There's 2 over center latches for the removal of the lid to the airbox. That'll be the lid. Then you'll remove the air filter, and then the little spark arrestor, flame arrestor, or whatever you'd like to call it. Now we're going to remove the breather hose and the evaporative emissions canister hose from the airbox itself, and then we're going to take the airbox out. The airbox is held in place by two 10mm nuts. We'll just set this aside momentarily. Okay, can you see that clearly with the camera? The next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the fuel input hose from the carburetor. Before you remove that hose, go over to this side and make sure that the fuel selector valve is in the off position. When you take this hose off, you may get a little bit of fuel dripping out, just what was in the hose. To undo a Corbin clamp, you simply squeeze on the two sides and just wiggle it back. And then slide the hose off that hose barb. And that's the fuel hose. Okay. The next thing we're going to do, we're going to go to the kit. This is the fuel pump. This port on the top is the pulse port. This port is the fuel input port, and this port is the fuel output port. You're going to have a section of hose, the Gates barricade fuel hose, approximately 6 feet long. I've already cut off two sections of it. You're going to take a 16-inch section. That will go on the output port of the fuel pump. Then you're going to take a 14-inch section of the hose, and that'll go on the input port of the fuel pump. Then in the bag of small parts, there are hose clamps. These two hoses are carrying gasoline, so that's why we're putting hose clamps on them. These hose clamps are very simple to operate. Put them in place and then squeeze them down nicely with a pair of pliers. Then you're going to have a remaining section of hose. I'm going to put the remaining section of hose on the fuel pump in its entirety, and we're going to trim it to fit. But that'll go on the pulse port. You do come with, or the kit does come with plenty of hose clamps. So even though this hose carries air and not gasoline, we're going to go ahead and put a hose clamp on this one too. Incidentally, when you squeeze these down, sometimes they'll go a little bit off center. Like that. Just put the pliers over it and squeeze it to get it tracking center, and then squeeze it the rest of the way on. if you clamp a hose clamp and you want to undo it, just take one side with a pair of pliers and push it over. Fairly easy to undo also. Okay. You'll notice that there's an area right behind the starter motor. We're going to slide the fuel pump. If you look, do you have the flashlight? There is a wiring harness. We can push that wiring harness down, and the fuel output hose will go all the way through and come out on the opposite side by the valve cover. The breather hose is also going to go above the carburetor area, so we'll start feeding that one through first because it's the longest hose. And as I said before, we'll trim it to fit later on. This is the output hose right here. We're going to slide that straight across and it'll come out over the valve cover. Then the input hose is this 14-inch section, and we're going to feed it over and it'll come out by the back of the carburetor. So, okay, so come on over here a minute and let me show you something. The fuel pump is going to rest right in here. The reason I wanted the fuel pump over here is because the fuel pump is never going to need to be serviced. And I didn't want the fuel pump getting in the way of the oil fill or any of the stuff that's normally serviced. I wanted it way out of the way. So when you come over here, remember this is the fuel output line. This is the pulse line, because it's the longer one that we're going to trim to fit. And this is the 14-inch, and that's going to be the fuel input line. So we'll go to the fuel output line, and we're going to put a fuel filter in it. The fuel line from the pump to the carburetor is going to sit down here, and if you're doing oil changes or anything like that, you'll simply fold it up out of the way. But when the generator's running, you'll fold it down here and you'll put the cover plate against it and it'll rest against the foam. So we're going to go ahead and put this fuel filter in, and remember the fuel flows from the pump through the filter to the carburetor, so you want to make sure that it flows the direction of the arrow on the fuel filter. I'm just going to leave the pulse line for right now. We're going to work on the fuel supply lines going into the fuel pump. Remember, this is the one that goes to the pump itself. This is the one that came from the stock tank. I'm going to set that Corbin clamp down here because it keeps sliding around on me. Next item is going to come in the kit. It's going to be a 1/4-inch nylon T-fitting. Take the hose that came from the stock tank, and this is important. Put one of the, either this or this fitting into the stock hose. You slide it on, and then we're going to move the Corbin clamp up into place. So it's going to be pointing like this. Then go around the other side and make sure that the fuel pump is resting where it will not get into any damage, because remember, the control box is going to bolt back up in here, and this rounded area goes over the starter motor. So just make sure that you've got room to push this fuel pump out of the way. And that's behind the terminals, and actually well behind the starter motor. So as long as this black flange is even with this casting, you're good. Then come around this side here, and this is going to be installed so that this hose that used to go to the carburetor is now pointed straight up, and we're going to trim this end to fit. So that's going to be cut right about here. Nice length of hose. And we're going to take this and push it in to this hose, which runs to the fuel pump. We'll take a hose clamp. And there we go. Okay, so this is now pointing straight up because ultimately the fuel inlet port is going to be right here. There'll be a hose connecting it because we want the fuel inlet port fairly protected, and we don't want the gasoline anywhere near the exhaust side of the generator. So let's take a short break. Now we're going to take this piece of hose, we're going to feed it through to where it comes out by the inverter. We're going to make sure we got a hose clamp on it, and we're going to put just one click so that it's easier to put it in place. And we're going to slide this onto the hose barb of the carburetor, right where this hose originally came off of. So we'll slide the carb back so we can get a pair of pliers in there to crimp that hose clamp. Okay, if you can see it, the hose clamp's in place there, and I'm going to see if I can get it just a little bit more snug. Okay, now it's nice and tight. Then just slide the carburetor back forward against the manifold, and make sure that on here you've got a gasket, then the steel plate, and then a gasket. Make sure none of the hoses are pinched or anything like that. And this is our fuel inlet hose, and it's going to come right around here. I'm going to spin this Corbin clamp just a little bit sideways. Okay. Now we'll take our airbox and bolt it in place. Where I left my airbox? Ah, here it is. Airbox goes in like this. And we'll take the two original nuts. Now we'll come over here. We just want to make sure that our pulse line is not kinked or anything like that. We want to see a nice place for it to come down to. We don't want to have it hitting the choke and accidentally choking the generator. We want to make sure that the choke can open all the way. Okay, I'm going to put one of the tie wraps that's included in the kit in there when we're done, because I don't want the choke to be restricted in any way, and a hose flopping over here could get in the way of the choke later on, as you can clearly see. So let's take a break for just a minute. Okay, remember the original breather hose went from this hole in the valve cover to this hole in the airbox. What we're going to do is we're going to install the PCV valve that came with the kit. And to do that, we'll take a section of hose. This is the one we just trimmed off at the end of the fuel input line. We want the pulse line to end up almost dead even with this side of the spark plug lead. So if we push this in, and then we trim this, and incidentally the PCV valve points this direction from the T-fitting. Okay, so I'm going to want it right even with this metal flange back here. So I'll trim that, and as a rule of thumb, it's easier to shorten the hoses than it is to lengthen them. So if in doubt, cut it extra long. You can always shorten it later. Okay. Then this is the pulse line going to the fuel pump, and as I said earlier, we don't want it to touch the choke. So we're going to run it right over here, and let's make sure nice smooth bends all the way, and it is. Okay, so now we're going to trim this right here. Put that pulse line right down onto the top of the T-fitting. And now we're going to take a zip tie and wrap it around that metal bracket and this hose to hold it in place nicely. I don't know if you can see that real clearly. What I've done is I've wrapped that zip tie around that metal flange. And now I'm going to go ahead and pull it snug. So that's going to hold this in place nicely. Like I said, it's just like working on a mercury outboard. Everything's black. I'm going to trim off the end of that zip tie. And now what we're going to do is we're going to trim the original breather line so that it is the length that we need to go from the PCV valve into the airbox again. So that's going to put it right about here. And as I stated earlier again, it's best to go a little too long. We can always shorten it if we went a little too long. So we'll put our breather line in there, and then we'll have a look at the length. That actually looks nice. Now I'm going to put a clamp right here because this hose is not as robust as the hoses in my kit. And in order to get a good strong pulse to the fuel pump, I really don't want a lot of leakage. Not that that's going to make a big difference because it is downwind of the PCV valve. Okay. Notice that the fuel filter is routed outside of the hose that goes from the fuel tank vent to the evaporative emissions canister. That way if you go to change the fuel filter, you can fold it out here and get at it easy and fold it back down. Then there is this one hose, I don't know if you remember it or not, first thing when we took off the airbox, it runs from the evaporative emissions canister into the side of the airbox. So we'll tuck that back in there. Now if you come around the back again, we've got the hose that is the inlet for the fuel pump. And we're going to be putting this to a hose barb. So let's test fit the lid to the airbox. This is the airbox lid. You'll notice there's a hose or a hole that goes to the top, and there's an angle cut on the bottom. And make sure when you put it in that you put it in just like that hole to the top. And we're just test fitting this for right now, just to show you how close quarters you're going to have it. Here is your fuel inlet line for the fuel pump. Let me see that flashlight just a minute. Okay, so you're going to have to line this up to where this hose lays right in this area, because you don't want it to be too far against the airbox or too far. It's got to fit the gap between the airbox and the inverter. All I'm doing is just sighting it where this is centered. And I'm just taking a Phillips head screwdriver and just making a mark on it. So, let's take a break for just a moment. Okay, so now we're going to take a drill, and I'm going to use a 1/4-inch drill bit as a starter. And we're going to go right where our marked spot. punch our pilot hole in there. Now make sure that you don't hit the antenna lead we had talked about earlier. That's this. And if there's any concerns that you have, just fold the antenna lead out of the way. Now you either use a series of larger and larger drill bits till you drill the hole large enough for this threaded portion to go through. I don't like using a drill because you can leave scratches on a customer's generator. If it's your own generator, of course, that's not a big issue. But if you're working on it for a customer, you don't want to leave scratches on it. So I'm going to use a repairman's reamer. Just kind of cut it out that way. What I've got my hand for is to catch the filings that are coming out. A little bit bigger. What we're going to do is we're going to be screwing these two together, and that plastic panel will be pinched between these two parts. So before we screw these together, we're going to take a roll of Teflon tape that's included in the kit and wrap these threads with Teflon tape. If you've got an air leak in your system, chances are it's right here at the threads. That's why I include the Teflon tape. Please use it. When you wrap the Teflon tape, wrap it in the direction that the threaded bar is going to go, and be very careful not to overlap the ends of the threads. If you overlap like this, it'll tear right across there, and you'll have a piece of Teflon floating around in your fuel system. It will get caught in the fuel filter, but why add additional debris to your fuel system? So what you want to do is 3 to 4 laps of Teflon tape around this. And incidentally, both these hexes are 5/8. Keep snugging it down until it starts to bind pretty good on that plastic flange. Okay. So now it's down there pretty snug. And now we'll take another section of hose, and what we're going to do is we're going to set it so that the two of these butt right up against each other. The nylon T-fitting versus the brass hose barb. You'll notice when we do that, this hose does not hit the corner of the inverter module, because we don't want those two hitting. So what we're going to do, mark that off right here. I want a nice square cut on the end, so I'll use the other end of this hose. That makes it easy too. I can use the printing. So this hose is now up on the bottom of the hose barb. Then we're going to shove this all the way up in here. And now, as you can see, there's clearance between that hose and the corner of the inverter module. You don't want those to touch if you can avoid it at all. And as you can see, it is possible to avoid it. So now we'll take two more hose clamps. And that's a little bit of a tight fit, but it's nowhere near as difficult as the EU 6500 Honda. Okay. Then you'll take the flame arrestor, and the little half moon goes in the bottom left-hand corner. Gotta get the over center latches out of the way there. Okay, so that's pushed in. Then you put the air filter in place. And now you got to put the lid on the airbox, and this time it's going to be difficult. It's starting to get a lot of stuff in here. I've got it set in there now. And now we've got to get the over center latches. One down. Two down. Okay. At this point, the kit is essentially installed. And if it were your personal unit, you'd put the control box back in place, and then you could test it with the other covers off. I'm going to go ahead and put all the covers on right now. So the first step is going to be, once again, looking here at the fuel pump, and just make sure that none of the hoses are bent at a real sharp angle. They're all nice, smooth radius bends. Box in place. And remember, the control box was held in place with the small screws that did not have a lock washer or a flat washer. This cover panel is held on with the 4 robust screws. See your flashlight. It's a good idea to just go through and make sure that nothing is pinched. I didn't remember if I had checked that or not. That's why I was pulling that panel out, shining a flashlight in there, just to make sure that there's nothing dropping in between the panel and the generator. Okay, on the back, remember we've got the antenna for the remote start. We want to make sure that the antenna for the remote start is pushed up and out of the way. And we've got the back panel. Okay, we're going to have to rotate this clamp because this is touching this clamp. So I'm going to rotate both the plastic clamp and the Corbin clamp. So we've got more room now. You can see where this box, the clamp has a wide portion where the clasp is, and now the wide portion is folded around to the side, so we're not running into that conflict anymore. So as you can see, it is fairly critical, the positioning of this fuel inlet port. You want it to dead centered between the airbox and the inverter module. I hesitate to tell you to drill it at a certain portion of the decal, because the decals were put on by somebody in a hurry, and the decals could be 1/4 of an inch off, and if you're going by the decal position, you could wind up with the hole drilled in the wrong spot. So that's why I suggest sighting it on the generator instead of trying to mark a specific place on a decal, because no two generators have the decal in the exact same spot. The last step will be to put the instruction decal on it. Tells you in order to run it from the stock tank, you follow the owner's manual. In order to run it from the remote tank, quick and easy, if you're running it off the remote tank, you'll put the fuel selector valve in the off position. If you're running it off the stock tank, you'll put the fuel selector valve in the on position. It's that simple. And you can install the decal wherever you'd like. The Furman is covered in decals. So to find an appropriate spot that's not already got, I think we're limited to right about here. Wow. That is, that's about it. Either the back panel here or the front panel. So I'm going to put it on the back panel because I think it'll get less abuse there. But basically it says what I just told you. If running off the stock tank, put the fuel selector valve in the on position. If running off the remote tank, put the fuel selector valve in the off position. Then to run the generator, you take the hose that's included with the kit. You'll notice that there are quick disconnects on both ends. One with the icon of the fuel tank connects to the fuel tank. One with a little arrow symbol connects to the generator. So you connect this to the generator, connect this to the fuel tank, pump the prime bulb until it gets firm, and go ahead and start your generator according to the instructions in the owner's manual. Incidentally, the kit does come with the quick disconnect that'll screw into your marine tank. So you've got one quick disconnect will hook to the generator, and the other one with the tank icon on it, will hook into the fuel tank. And that should just about cover it.